Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another session of Intellectus Campus. As part of our integrative medicine approach, this includes ADHD, but it also falls into the substance use disorder category, and I'll get into why that is in a minute. Before we continue, Pride, can you please confirm that you can actually hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I apologize. I've had a bit of a cold, so I'm a little bit hoarse. Yeah, I just have had a bit of flu, so I should be okay. So I'll proceed with the integrative approach to ADHD, and I just wanted to give you a slightly different perspective on it because I think that a lot of us underestimate what the implications of not treating this very, very common condition are. I'd also like to apologize. I had a bit of a technical failure with my computer a bit earlier. So I'm on someone else's computer, but I've pretty much worked out how to use it. So let's go into attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. What is it? The criteria to define it are that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, that it is defined by persistent, impairing, and developmentally inappropriate, inattentive, disorganized, and/or hyperactive impulsive behaviors, and these lie at the far end of a normally distributed continuum. So the three types really are inattentive, impulsive, and hyperactive, and they can overlap. So to try and put it more simply so that we understand it, because I know that there are parents on this call, it's excessive inattention, excessive impulsivity, excessive hyperactivity that is inappropriate for age. So the symptoms that you will see often in a child is difficulty concentrating on tasks, and obviously this is age appropriate, getting distracted quickly and easily, forgetfulness, talking a lot, becoming frequently impatient, interrupting others, missing details or making mistakes when learning, being disorganized, and an inability to focus. And obviously, a lot of us know a lot of these kind of kids. Thank you. Well, I think one of the important things to look at is whether this is age inappropriate and whether it is impairing the child's education. So, if we look at the history of ADHD, and I'm going back to the Victoria Falls conference here, it wasn't really until 1968 that it began to be separated from general reactions and became its own diagnosis and was referred to as the hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. And this reaction was characterized by a short attention span, hyperactivity, and restlessness. In 1980, when they published the DSM-3, the diagnosis was made more specific and was described as attention deficit disorder. But by this time, the treatment was already being treated with stimulant medications, treatments still used to this day, which we will go through. But I want to look at everything else that needs to be done with ADHD. So the first thing to note is it is the most common neurodevelopmental disorder which will present to a child and adolescent mental health, pediatric, and primary care service. So I think that it's quite important to be aware that your patients are likely to bring in children with learning disabilities that may have this disorder, and that it's quite important to understand why it's important to treat it. So timely and effective interventions to address core ADHD symptoms and co-occurring problems are a high priority for healthcare and society more widely. This is from Jeff Cooley's book, and I think this is probably the most important slide of the whole presentation. And I think that it starts with at about 6 years old, you will see a child present with what appears to be only ADHD. With time, they develop low self-esteem because the teachers disciplining them for being disruptive. They develop disruptive behavior, they develop poor social skills, they develop learning delays, and with that comes low self-esteem. And when they get into their teens, they can get oppositional defiant disorder, and they can get quite challenging behavior. Now, with time as well, they will, not all of them, but they may develop school exclusion, they may be expelled, substance abuse, conduct disorder, lack of motivation, complex learning difficulties, and even criminal behavior. So not treating this 6 years old can have significant implications when they get older and when they get into high school. So how common is it? It's actually over 5%, although most are not severe. In 2012, the CDC published their summary health stats, and they estimated almost 6 million US children were diagnosed with ADD. We all know that boys are much more likely than girls to have the hyperactivity form of ADHD. Girls are much more likely to be missed because they are a lot less disruptive. They tend to be the dreamers. The statistic that stood out the most, however, and this goes back to the Vic Falls conference, is that the general health status of the children surveyed was actually one of the most important factors, and that children who had a fair or poor health status were almost 7 times more likely to have a learning disability and almost 4 times more likely to have the clinical diagnosis of ADHD. Now, I know that between parental and teacher and school pressure, this may be being overdiagnosed, but it's also very important to understand that if you do have a child who is presenting with this, you need to discuss a lot more than medication with the parents. So if we look at the difference between boys and girls, boys exceed girls in all learning disabilities. But if we look at ADHD specifically, we can see that the incidence of ADHD in boys can be as high as 7%, and in girls, probably about half of that, or just slightly half of that, at about 3%. Now, most of us know the types, but I'm going to go through it again just so that we understand it. The types are 1, inattentive, 2, hyperactive and impulsive, and 3, a combination of both. So an inattentive patient, the parents might complain that the child is easily distracted, has trouble following directions, finishing tasks, has poor listening skills, has trouble paying attention, makes careless mistakes, forgets things easily, has problems organizing daily tasks, and has trouble sitting still, often loses things and daydreams a lot. Now, I used to run an ADHD clinic when I used to work in Dubai, and this absolutely describes a little girl called Phoebe who really honestly believed that she was stupid and that she was unable to learn. And with treatment, she completely turned around. Now we have Max. Now Max was a hyperactive, impulsive child. He squirmed, fidgeted, and bounced when he was sitting. He had trouble staying seated. His maths results were bottom of the class. He was not able to play quietly by himself. He was always moving in the playground, running, climbing on things, falling, injuring himself. He talked excessively. He had huge trouble waiting for his turn. He blurted out answers and he interrupted others with regularity. And again, this child responded extremely well to treatment. So in girls, I think it's important just to be aware that girls who are more withdrawn, who are more quiet, who are forgetful and easily distracted, may well have undiagnosed ADHD. Now let's start looking at this slightly differently so that people potentially look at what they think ADHD is, particularly medical practitioners, and what people think it is trouble focusing, immaturity, hyperactivity, fidgeting, poor parenting. Whereas what it actually is a poor working memory. They are easily distracted. They are impulsive. They have poor executive and frontal lobe function. They have a poor sense of time. They have anxiety. They have poor organization. And they have a lot of absent-mindedness. And now let's start looking at the causes, because this is where it becomes really important. There's been a long argument as to whether this is genetic or whether it is environmental. And the answer is that it is both. There are definitely genetics involved, and I will go into that. There is biochemistry involved, which we will go into. I'm not going to go into the full biochemistry of it. I'm going to go into what we can do about it in Africa. The dietary issues are significant. Children are drinking. I was in a supermarket the other day, and I watched a group of school children come through on a school tour, and all they bought was Coca-Cola chips and sweets. So the dietary implications in terms of aggravating this and setting off the genetics of it are important. Also, the toxins that are in preservatives are also important, and that's why I go back to the 1968, 1980 kind of change, because this has become infinitely more prevalent since we've gone into a much faster lifestyle. We're very lucky in Africa. We have a lot less of it, but certainly in the developed world, as it were, or the advanced world, they see a huge amount of this, and a lot of it is due to very poor dietary choices. Also, the environment, the learning environment for many of these children is incredibly boring. And they're also, when they're not in the learning environment, they're getting very, very rapid sort of 10-minute spells of concentration on their cell phones. Most children these days in the advanced world do have cell phones. Fortunately, we're very fortunate in Africa in that it's a lot less prevalent. So going back to the fact that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, that it has inattentive, disorganized, and or hyperactive impulsive behavior, that it's excessive attention impulsivity and hyperactivity appropriate for age, we would then confirm that it's actually a clinical diagnosis. However, a lot of research recently has looked at the hypothesis that the actual structure of the brain and the integration of the nerve cells that are at fault, are these partially or wholly causing the ADHD? And what if you could test for challenges and imbalances with diagnostic treatment, with testing, and treat that person biochemically? Would their symptoms be improved? And certainly it's not a cure, but it's an improvement. So I'd recommend that you have a look at this website, which is called mensamedical.com. and it recognizes the biochemical subtypes of focus and attention symptoms. Only going to focus on two of them at the moment. One of them is the undermethylation genetics. We know that it's a lot less prevalent in the Black population. It's a lot more prevalent in the Caucasian population. Methylation is the ability of the body to turn on or off certain enzymes, hormones, genes, and most importantly, neurotransmitters by way of adding a carbon group, which is a carbon atom bonded with 3 or more hydrogen atoms. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. These methyl groups can radically alter perception and behavior. People with few methyl groups are called undermethylators. They're often perfectionistic, they're persistent, high achieving, and people who are diagnosed with ADHD are often in this category. I'm not going to go into too much of the methylation cycle because I think very few people in here are interested in the biochemistry of it. But what I would like you to look at what drives it. So vitamin B12, vitamin B6, and your folates are driving it. And that's where diet comes in really important. It's important to get your B12 from ideally meat products. It's important to get your folate and B6 from your green leafy vegetables. And it's estimated in the UK at the moment that some children are only eating these about once a week. If we look at neurotransmitters, the ones I'm going to focus on are GABA, which is calming, acetylcholine, which is learning, glutamate, which can be excitatory, but is also involved in memory, and dopamine, because they seem to be some of the most important ones. Now, I've mentioned zinc before. Patients with low zinc, and we know that low zinc is common in Africa, means you can't regulate GABA, which is your calming hormone. So I've put a couple of arrows at what I think we can do in Zimbabwe and in Africa. We can reduce the zinc deficiency. It's very affordable. Zinc tablets are very, very cheap. They're about 63 cents for 10, and they're a lot less expensive than some of the pharmaceutical drugs. Probiotics, these can be given as the Everlife brand I've promoted in the past. I think it's a very good probiotic, but probiotics will also come from eating the right kinds of food, particularly in this country. I think a lot of lacto, a lot of fermented products, kefir, those kind of things will make a difference. Glutamine is very settling to the gut. We know that leaky gut contributes to this. So glutamine at a good dose of 5 grams a day, and you can buy a large container, which will last probably almost a year for probably the price of 1 box of Ritalin. Vitamin B6 deficiency you can get from your diet. Magnesium, again, is affordable. And you need to look for chronic stress in these children. So again, going back to the causes, what about the dietary treatments, and also what other treatments are available? Now, the conventional treatments we're all familiar with are stimulants, and that includes Ritalin and Adderall. A lot of parents display concern because of the risk of suicidal thinking, personality changes. Ritalin is a central nervous system stimulant. It can cause nervousness, agitation, anxiety, insomnia. We all know the symptoms of it. One of the other concerns, it has an on-off effect, so that the child will have a Ritalin before they go to school. They'll do well, and then they will withdraw at about 10, 11 o'clock, and their behavior will deteriorate further. Adderall's not available in this country, which is good because it is actually highly addictive and it can result in quite extreme mood swings. So with these side effects, it's easy to see why so many patients are seeking effective natural remedies for ADHD. The good news is that there are natural remedies that are both effective and without the side effects of the prescription medication. We've been through the importance of a healthy diet. Many adults have ADHD, and the solutions here are to create organizational systems that work. There is no organizational solution that works for everyone. It may be a pen and paper checklist. It may be a more technical application that can include automatic reminders, and using technology, if you're going to use it, should be used to your advantage. Exercise is important. It helps relieve stress in particular, and also the movement often improves these kids with ADHD, but it will also improve adults. Sleep, well-balanced diet, dietary changes, these are all fairly obvious, but they're things that tend to be omitted from a standard GP consultation. And I'd recommend that if you don't have time to go through this, it would be a good idea to refer your patient to somebody who's a dietitian, who's experienced in these kind of things. Many patients will know what the ADHD and ADD trigger foods are and will replace them with healthier options that will dramatically help reduce this behavioral disorder. Smartphone addiction is becoming a major issue. Kids are on their phones continually, so are many adults. And there's many studies that actually show that this aggravates ADD and ADHD, and ADHD is repeatedly linked to cell phone addiction. So getting back to ADHD, it's linked to addictive behavior. People with ADHD have higher levels of impulsivity, harder to control their behaviors, more prone to boredom, and are more likely to become addicted, particularly with behavioral addictions as well as substance use disorder. So several studies have looked at this relationship and suggested the condition is linked to substance use dependence. So it becomes really important to understand how important it is to treat when they are young. As far as methylation goes, you need to improve your B vitamins. You need to be very careful about diet. In this country, we're very fortunate. Children do a lot of exercise. Vitamin D levels get people into the sun. It may be one of the reasons we have less of a problem. And we need to apply psychological approaches, which I'll get into a little bit later. Getting into dopamine and glutamate. There is a dysfunctional interaction between dopamine and glutamate systems, and it's been implicated in numerous neuropsychiatric disorders, including ADHD. Glutamate is excitatory, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, it causes a lot of hyperactive behavior. So extensive investigations have been made about the structure and function of this family of neurotransmitters. And the treatment involves things as simple as N-acetylcysteine, which is available from most pharmacies at a dose of 2 grams a day, in combination with glutamine at 5 grams a day, which also helps to heal the gut. Beware MSG in foods. MSG is in most addictive foods, particularly those containing carbohydrates fried in seed oils. Things like knickknacks may completely trigger hyperactive behavior in certain children. I'm not going to go into this slide in too much detail, other than to mention that the balance between dopamine and glutamate is very important in balancing these children out. Now, getting back to the combined type, a child with combined ADHD has symptoms of both inattention and hyperactivity, and the combined type is the most common type. So a child-centric approach becomes important. And we have heroes and we have villains, and that is what we need to actually portray to children. And one of the villains is sucrose. And there have been multiple studies that show that following high sucrose drinks, which you will see in every store that you go to, in every supermarket, in following sucrose drinks, children showed a decrement in performance in a structured testing situation, and they demonstrated more inappropriate behavior during free play. The other big villain is a leaky gut. Now, it's very common to see a child who has gastrointestinal symptoms and food intolerance and allergies, all of which have been linked to ADHD and to other neurodevelopmental disorders. And there is a high level of a leaky gut biomarker called zonulin, which correlates with severe ADHD problems in children. Candida in the gut, and Candida is very fond of sugar, so it is abundant in children with ADHD, and it also may create leaky gut. The gut-brain axis we've discussed in detail before. We know that shifts away from traditional lifestyles and traditional diets impact the gut microbiome composition and function and may increase the risk of developing a neurodevelopmental disorder. So given that ADHD is now the most prevalent neurodevelopmental disorder, we really should be educating a lot more early and a lot more strongly on the role of a healthy diet. This is to do with the microbiome. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, except that you can see that certain gut microbiomes are very, very prevalent in children with ADHD. And these results are in line with recent studies supporting gut microbiome differences in neurodevelopmental disorders. And although the mechanistic explanation remains unknown, there's definitely a positive correlation between certain bacteria and hyperactive behavior in toddlers. So without getting into too much of the biochemistry, the answer is to fix the gut. So the gut microbiota plays a crucial role in regulating the gut-brain axis. It affects neurodevelopment and behavior. Dysbiosis, which is characterized by an imbalance in microbial composition, will potentially affect brain function. And gut permeability, systemic inflammation, and psychiatric disorders are related. So a scientifically plausible rationale is that a leaky gut refers to the increased intestinal permeability, potentially allowing harmful substances to allow the bloodstream, and those harmful substances would include peptide chains as opposed to amino acids. And they would also include immunogenic substances and bacteria. So if you do have a child with ADHD, it's a good idea to recommend a diet with glutamine to improve their diet, and possibly to also give them probiotics. We've also discussed let food be thy medicine. The top foods for ADHD are additive-free and unprocessed as far as possible, high in B vitamins, which is leafy vegetables, and most children don't like leafy vegetables, so they may need to be disguised in spaghetti bolognese and juiced. We know that B6, which can be supplemented, is slightly more effective than Ritalin in improving behavior. And we also know that tryptophan is an essential amino acid that helps the body to synthesize proteins and aid in the production of serotonin. Serotonin plays a significant role in sleep, in inflammation, in emotional moods, and in very, very much more. In individuals who suffer from ADD, ADHD, imbalances in serotonin levels have been indicated according to the University of Michigan. Serotonin is related to impulse control, it's related to aggression, and these are two of the symptoms that can cause problems with children with ADHD who can end up with expulsion issues and with trouble at school. So the ADHD foods to avoid are sugar. This is the primary and most important trigger for most children. And try and avoid or minimize concentrated sugar, including candy, desserts, soda, or fruit juices. Excuse me. Gluten affects the gap junctions in the gut. And children will react to gluten. You will know which children are gluten intolerant, and their behavior will often deteriorate. Conventional dairy, particularly pasteurized milk, will contain an A1 casein as opposed to the A2 casein. Now, Friesland cows in particular produce A1 casein, and one of the things to ask a parent is whether their child is reacting to dairy products, in which case you need to possibly minimize them for 3 to 6 months until the gut actually heals. And if you reintroduce them and the behavior occurs, you need to stop them. Avoid food coloring and dyes. I had a patient whose behavior after cream soda, or what we used to call cherry plum, went completely off the wall. His parents knew to avoid that, but children with ADHD can be sensitive because of their genetics to a variety of food dyes and colorings. So just be careful with processed foods, and caffeine can obviously trigger these kids quite severely, and minimizing or avoiding caffeine is important. Now, this is an extremely difficult diet for a child to actually follow, but if we start educating people on what the implications of not following it are, we might end up without the problems that we're seeing in our adolescent children. We all know in Harare what some of the impulsive behavior has been like, the drug behavior on the road, the alcohol consumption, and some of this could be avoided by earlier treatment. So your top 5 natural remedies for ADHD are omega-3 supplementation. They benefit ADHD patients. And if you can get fish oil is critical for brain function and is anti-inflammatory. Children with ADD need more B vitamins. If you can't get vegetables into their diet, even in a disguised way, it's very important that you supplement with B vitamins. The 3 multi-mineral supplements that are the most important are zinc, magnesium, and calcium. In adults, you would use 500 milligrams of calcium, 250 of magnesium, and 5 of zinc twice a day. All relax the nervous system. Probiotics have been mentioned, and GABA is very hard to come by here, but at 250 milligrams twice a day, it can improve things. Rhodolia rosacea has been proven effective at improving the focus of both adults and children. This is available in many herbal shops. It's also available in many pharmacies, and it increases the sensitivity in the neurological and the nervous system that produces serotonin and dopamine. Getting back to something we've discussed before, which is ashwagandha. Ashwagandha is an adaptogen. It reduces cortisol. It's thought to have anti-inflammatory effects, which may be helpful in reducing symptoms of ADHD, and it works by reducing oxidative stress and inflammation in the brain. It is also effective in reducing inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, anxiety, and depression, and it can improve cognitive function in children. It also improves the quality of sleep. So, in terms of adults, many adults may present, and you may diagnose them with depression or with anxiety or with a multitude of other conditions because they have difficulty focusing and concentrating on a task, a project, or a conversation. They may have restlessness, restless legs, emotional issues, frequent mood swings. They may be prone to anger and a hot temper. They may be disorganized. I'm sure all of us know patients who are like this. They may have low tolerance. They may be complaining of excess anger. They may have unstable relationships and increased risks for addiction. So a multimodal approach is required for both adults and children. The first thing that probably needs to be assessed is a family history. It's important to educate these people as to what may be causing many of their symptoms. It is important, if required, to use or do a trial of a stimulant medication. Dietary is probably the most important thing that a medical person can actually go through. They can be coached through this. There are behavioral strategies that can be employed, and there are psychological and psychiatric strategies that can be employed. The problem with sending to psychiatry is that they often end up on antidepressants and other psychiatric medications. So with that, I've gone through this relatively quickly because I was expecting a couple of questions on it. So I'd like to end it there. I do have a series of additional biochemical slides. I strongly recommend the website adhdhelp.co.za. There's a lot of very, very good information on there that is very child-centric. And then I'd like to open the floor to discussions about how commonly people actually are seeing this, how much of a problem they find that it is, and how easy they find it to actually treat. Now, the screen I'm in, I'm unable to see the chat. So, Pride, are there any questions in the chat? No? Anybody have any questions? I also can't see whether hands are being raised or not.
I don't know if you can hear me. It's Rita.
I can hear you, Rita.
Yeah, I can just, testify. I have 4 children, of which the twins and especially my boy was extremely ADHD. Now he's now 31 years old. It never really leaves you, but if you do learn the lifestyle and adapt with the food, there's a lot of there's a beautiful side to ADHD too, because it's children with ADHD and adults have much more energy than other people, but it is detrimental that they learn the discipline. And you mentioned how difficult it is to follow a diet for a child. Well, we've been through it. We've literally cut out everything in the house, sugars, tomato sauces, everything for a year, which might have helped the gut microbiome. And use sports, swimming, triathlon. I can't mention, I think about 5 or 6 different sports that this little boy do. And he is very successful today, but he still has the ADHD. He only completed his degree now, but and the computer and television screen time is the other thing I really agree with. There was no way we could have had a TV in our house or computers. And there's so much value in diet and then in keeping screen time to the minimum. It's not just the child, it's the whole family who needs to adapt, because you can never put only your one child on a strict diet and the rest of the family lives wrong.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And one of the other things I think that it's important to understand is that ADHD children are put in an educational system that does not suit them. So I had a young boy called Michael who was diagnosed with ADHD quite early. And when he was 12, he was asked not to write his exams because it would affect the school average. This child was clearly highly intelligent. He was totally obsessed with computers, and he was totally obsessed with dinosaurs. And his parents took him out of conventional schooling, put him into an ADHD school. They were in a financial position to do so. And this child absolutely flourished in a different environment. And in that environment, he wrote his first computer programs when he was in his mid-teens. And he eventually wrote a dinosaur computer program that made him a significant amount of money by the time he was 18. So I think we have to also consider that there's a square peg in a round hole.
Yes.
And the problem is sometimes the square peg is perceived as the square peg, where in actual fact, it is the round hole that's the problem. So putting 30 children in a classroom and expecting them to sit down and learn, and you've got ADHD children in that classroom, can be very difficult, and it can be very disruptive for some of the other kids. So the other thing is that ADHD kids have enormous levels of energy. So once they find what they love in life and they put everything into what they love in life, then you will find that they will often, I've given the negative side of ADHD and why it's important to detect and treat it. But the positive side is that people with ADHD very often become very successful because they can work an 18-hour day if they're doing what they love doing.
That's 100%. I fully agree with that. The other side, I've studied psychology, criminology at this stage, and the other downside of not treating ADHD also in a community, starting with the individual, is that I have found that children with ADHD, if they don't get the right treatment and support, those are your juvenile criminals. They turn out because they've got too much energy and they've got nowhere to focus it. So it's really a crisis. We need to help these children.
I agree. And I think it's also a public health crisis. And I think this slide had the most impact on me when I was running an ADHD clinic, is that these kids, not all of them, but I certainly know of one young man who was probably going to be head boy of his school. He was exceptionally talented in terms of his sporting ability. He was a highly intelligent young man. I used to work in a pediatric clinic. But he obviously had symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity. He had a few fractures from doing things that were excessively impulsive. And then when he was 17, he was expelled from school for substance use. And his life is now an utter mess. And he has been in jail a number of times. And I mean, I knew him 20 years ago. I'm just trying to think, it would have been the early 2000s. And when I look at the implications of not treating that adequately, if we look at it from a greater social justice, social, you know, a public health point of view, I think it's going to become a disaster. I also think that what we're seeing, as well as all of this, with the increase in substance use disorder in the young people, I think a lot of it may be screen addiction. I think a lot of it may be untreated ADHD. And I think if we don't do something about it, I'm not too sure what the societal implications will be in the long run. So I think this slide is one that's worth screenshotting and potentially showing to parents who do have children with problems. Good. With that, with absolutely no disrespect, I am losing my voice, and I think I'm going to end it there. I think that we've covered most of the major issues. I think the recording of this is going to be important, and it needs to be shown at all sorts of levels, including public health levels. And I think that we should be starting to increase awareness in schools of ADHD and how it's managed. I don't know if anybody would agree or disagree with that. Good. So with that, can we end the recording? And Pride, can you stop recording? Oh, I've got